ready to discuss.
Yeah, let's whip it.
Okay, so I'm just gonna talk about I'm just gonna
Should we
bring up
do a
kind
bit
of.
of an intro? Like, should we throw a little bit of an intro in that we can edit in? Like a what's
I'd
up?
say
Like
we
I
do that at the end.
okay.
So the book I've been reading, I'm only like 30 pages into it. It's called The Ape Who Understood the Universe, and it's by
Who
this
wrote that
dude that
again?
hmm
Who wrote that?
Steven something. Steven Stewart Williams. He's some random professor from Malaysia. Because I was like, where does this is how is this guy? This one book kind of popped off for him. Is kind of the extent. And so far, he's breaking down what evolution is and what the purpose of it is, therefore trying to scientifically identify the purpose of human existence, right? And so the first kind of hypothesis that he came to were Darwinian. They were natural selection. We're just kind of defining evolution. What is the purpose of evolution, right? So it's like this kind of first couple hypotheses were, to promote the survival and the replication of specific organisms because they survive better, right? Survival of the fittest. We know that. But he goes, well, not really, because me having a child doesn't mean that that child is me, because it's not. It's a completely different organism. It's still a human, but it's completely different. So he was breaking it down even further. And the extent that he broke it down to was to the gene level. He was saying it is like a gene's eye view, where basically the genetic code of our beings have made it to this point because those genes prompted the survival and replication of the gene, maybe not only on the individual level. So maybe I'll have children and those children will continue to promote my genes. However, my relatives can also promote some of my genes, because he also talked about like social creatures such as ants, bees, wasps, things that live together, and they can almost be considered one organism because they all are kind of living together for one main like purpose together, right? So, and the interesting part about that was there are certain bees that will literally explode and then when they explode, I think they release like some sort of maybe poisonous, or I don't remember exactly what it is, but something to deter whatever the predator was. And he was like, well, even though they are ending the life of that individual organism, they are still, by deterring the predator, promoting their genes that are within the queen of the hive, which I thought was really interesting to think about. And so basically, our genes are controlling us to promote the reproduction of those genes. Not only on the individual level, but also on the greater scope of
The
other
macro.
things. Yeah, so even if you meet people that are really similar to you, you may also want to do things that are good for them, because those things that are similar on the genetic level, which is just really, really interesting to
I
think
mean,
about.
it's kind of around the idea. I mean, that kind of sounds like something that might explain things like compassion and empathy as well on an evolutionary scale, is the fact that
Yeah,
like if I like you, because and the reason that I like you is essentially boiled down to the fact that you are someone who's similar to me, then me benefiting your existence is not only benefiting my existence, but potentially benefiting the rest of my genealogy. Not even if I have kids, literally just the gene code that is within us that allows us to be similar. That's
exactly.
that's cool. I
It's
like that.
really cool, and it makes you think that like the purpose of evolution is just to possibly indefinitely continue the existence of specific genes. It's possible that it continues indefinitely, which is something that was just mind-boggling to me to
Now,
think
like here's what I guess I don't understand though. What's the difference necessarily between that and like straight up Darwinian, like natural selection? The creature that survives better produces offspring, and then because that creature has essentially better genes to survive better, has adapted better, then the next creature will be better off than if just to use bees. If one bee is more suited to 90-degree heat versus another bee who struggles to exist in 90-degree heat in Texas, the bee who exists better in the 90-degree heat will continue to promote its genes because of that.
So that's a tough one because those are damn near clones because they're eusocial. So those I use a different. So let's use a different example, just
Okay.
like deer. Like let's say
Yeah. Yeah.
deer that
Those
are better
two.
existing in 90-degree heat, right?
Yeah.
And the difference is that Darwinian was tied to the organism. It was tied to. It was saying that the organism is promoting the continuation of itself, but that's
Oh.
not what we're doing. We're continuing the existence of the gene because we're gonna die. You know, the for example, the number of Parkers that exist is one, and that's never gonna change.
So like.
However, the genes within me that are also within my parents that were good enough to promote the survival of the gene, not even the organism, but the gene, are going to be the ones that maintain.
That that's interesting because I guess I never interpreted Darwinian evolution as like I never interpreted survival of the fittest as a literal like this organism is the best organism and so it is trying to reproduce itself in order to like I don't know. I always viewed it much more along the lines of what you're talking about, which is just essentially this gene, like my genes are better, and so my genes are going to carry on. Less so I am going to carry on. It's just the fact that because I am like better suited for this environment than you are, my reproductive success will most likely be higher, even if it's just on the basis that I'm probably going to survive and you aren't, then my genes will get carried out because they are more suited for that environment. Um, so I guess I kind of interpreted it as what he's saying, which maybe that's just because I haven't looked into I probably haven't. No, straight up, I have not looked into evolution as much as I should have, other than to like just understand the fact that it is the case. Like, I will say, I had a conversation with one of my family members recently about evolution, and it was on the basis of religion. Um, and they actually don't believe in evolution.
Yeah.
Like they think they're actually. In fact, I felt bad about it because a couple days previously, I'd kind of been dissing young Earth creationists, which young Earth creationists are people who very often, it's not always, but almost exclusively take a very literal account of the Bible as like inherently objectively true. So like they think the Adam and Eve story is not like a parable. They think it is what happened. And so they think that the earth and the sun and the moon and the land and the heavens were all created in the order that it says it was in the Bible with the timeline the Bible provides, which that's another tricky thing because the timeline of the Bible, other than the fact that it tracks genealogy to some extent, the timeline of the Bible is pretty hard to really narrow down. Like for instance, if you said like Old Testament period, that can be 5,000 years. Like so, it could also be 2,000, 4,000. So like it's kind of a tough one, but I don't know. It was actually mind blowing because I'd kind of been hating on young Earth creationists a couple days before, and I was like, and I am assuming they just didn't know what that was. And I was like, yeah, young Earth creationists are something that baffles me. Like, I just don't actually understand how you can believe the Earth is 10,000 years old. Like, especially considering that there are civilizations. For instance, just to use examples out of the Bible, the cities that we have kind of given credit to as being possibly Sodom and Gomorrah, which are two cities in the Bible that were destroyed. Um, both of the cities that we've kind of accredited those biblical stories to
What cities
are
are they?
Sodom and Gomorrah. So
But what
they
are
were
the cities that we've is do wait, did we give those cities the same name,
no. So
same modern name?
no. So what we have done is like people archaeologists who are trying to essentially either disprove or prove or just know about the Bible are like looking for things that would indicate this is the city that was Sodom because both of them were
Mhm,
destroyed.
mhm,
And then this is the city that would be Gomorrah. Right
mhm.
now, I it's a tricky subject because one, some people don't think the cities are either of those, especially because the cities that we found, and I can't remember the exact names of them. So I think one of them might be like, I'm not even going to try because I genuinely just can't really remember. But the cities that we have found that are possibly those, a lot of people don't think they are, especially because according to the biblical timeline, when these cities were destroyed, would not have made sense. It's kind of like the Jericho thing. Like we know that Jericho existed, and we know at some point the Israel, like the tribe of Israel,
Can
was
you explain what the Jericho is?
Jericho is it's one of the most famous stories in all the Bible. So um, Joshua and his like group of people were going through their I mean I'm gonna call it a
Who's your
tirade.
disciples?
What?
Josh was a disciple?
No, this is Old Testament.
Mm,
So Joshua was one of the like first. Israelites that was like in charge of the tribe of Israel, and they were going through a lot of the Middle
What's
East. To
what roughly is like the time period this is supposed to be in?
That's kind of the issue. Is
Mm,
the Bible and what archaeology suggests just don't line up. And the other main issue with the timeline of this is that the events of Exodus, specifically, which are like the Jews leaving Egypt, and then going through the desert for the 40 years, like Exodus, a lot of it's a touchy subject. Historically, it is pretty I am pretty confident in saying historically the Exodus, at least in the way that the Bible portrays it to have happened, did not happen. Just almost straight up didn't happen, because the Bible says that, and it actually gives numbers and figures, around 1 million Jews. So and the figures it gives, you can interpret it as anywhere between like 600,000 and like 1.5, like 1.2, 1.5 million, something like that. It says that those people traveled through the desert for 4 years, and we don't have any evidence of that. Like, we don't have any evidence. The Egyptians, who were notoriously detailed record keepers, in fact, the first mention we have of Israel, period, is from Egypt. And it is the only mention of it is that it was destroyed. And this is much before like the Exodus really would have taken place. But there's no mention of having any Israelite slaves, let alone a million of them. And then the other thing is that we haven't found any archaeological evidence, unless I've missed something, um, or I'm unaware of something, that suggests that a group of people this large traveled the area of the desert for 40 years. Like, we don't really have any pots, pans, we don't have bones of oxes, we don't have we don't have really human remains. We really don't have almost anything. And one of the arguments for that is, like, over the course of 8,000 years, 6,000 years, a lot of that stuff would decompose 100%, except for the fact that in that exact area of other places, we have, especially in the desert, we have human remains in terms of teeth, because teeth are one of the things that stick around for a long time. But then we also do have clay pots and things like that from other civilizations of that time period in deserts. So it's a it's a watery claim to me. It seems kind of like a biblical apologetics like claim, which is like, apologetics is usually kind of just like defending the Bible. That's
mm,
not exactly what it is, but often that's what it is. But kind of besides the point, Jericho is one of the cities that, so Joshua's time period was interesting because the Israelites were supposed to go and wipe out basically all of the tribes that were in the land of Israel, which included Canaanites, Hebusites, Jebusites. It included a ridiculous amount of people. Like, I think it's like it's a couple hundred cities at least, or I don't know. I want to say at least, but it's a couple hundred cities that they are supposed to essentially just wipe out. In fact, God puts something called the ban on all of these places, and it's essentially that the Israelites are going to go destroy these cities, but they're not allowed to take any women. They're not allowed to take any gold. They're not allowed to take any plunder whatsoever. They're supposed to go in and kill literally everything. They're supposed to kill the men, the women, the children. They're supposed to kill the animals. Like, it is a complete destruction of a civilization. Now, there's random time periods, which is strange, that they're allowed to take only the virgin women, which seems another one of those things that's like iffy.
mm-hmm.
So like, one of the cities they destroy is Ai. It's a really big prominent one that like you hear about in the Bible. But then the main one is Jericho, and Jericho is a super famous city. It's got these crazy walls. It is, it's untouchable. The defense of Jericho is untouchable. And so the story is and I might be misconstruing this a little bit, because, to be honest, like, a lot of the biblical stories are just things I haven't heard in a long enough time period that I don't want to pretend as though I just know them perfectly. But like, Jericho, they walk around the walls for a couple days, and then the priests are carrying the Ark of the Covenant on their backs, and every time they circle, like, they get to the point, I think they circle a certain amount of times every day, and they blow the trumpet. And on, maybe it's I want to say it's like the third or the fifth or the seventh day of them doing this, the um the walls crumble, and so they're able to access Jericho. They're able to invade Jericho. And so the Jericho is probably one of the most prominent. Like, dude, VeggieTales has a story about Jericho. Like,
I
it's
love that show.
dude, VeggieTales is pretty good. But it's like it's one of the key stories in the Old Testament. Well, for instance, one of the things that, at least according to the things that I've seen on archaeology, is that the time period in which Israel would have come to Jericho would have been 400 to 500 years after the original walls fell. Now, there might have been another built, but it would not have been the walls of Jericho. It wouldn't have been these absurdly powerful, like indestructible walls, right? So the biblical timeline is just it's pretty tough to work with. In fact, that's really the issue with a lot of the archaeology is it's hard to track when these things are really supposed to happen in the Bible and when they actually happen in real life. Like there's just there's a whole lineage of things that are hard to contend with the timeline in the Bible. But specifically kind of that time period between like Exodus and, I mean, like we know David, the King David. I'm sure you like, I'm assuming you've heard
Yeah,
of
I've
him.
heard of him.
Okay, like King David and like Solomon, we know that those people existed. Like Solomon's wisdom was talked about through the great expanses of the world. Like people came to other kings came to Solomon for advice. He had he had around 1,000 wives, a lot of which were from other like kingdoms and things to make peace. Now, actually, it's funny because one of the few things that God said was to not intermarry, which is actually comes into the Bible later because that's one of the main reasons that Israel falls, and you have like Judah and then Israel. But that again, all there's lots of things in the Bible that we can talk about. But the timeline of it is tough. But the thing is with Sodom and Gomorrah specifically, the cities that we've attributed what those possibly could be to had civilizations that were longer than what the young Earth creationists think is the timeline of the Earth. And so, like,
Longer than 10,000 years.
Yeah, like one of those civilizations, we appear to think it was at least, it wasn't like a city necessarily at the time, but it had people living there from at least like 12,000 years ago. And
Okay,
so
so you're just saying civilization, not necessarily ruled under one.
right.
Yeah,
I just mean a people group living in an area working
gotcha,
together somewhat
gotcha.
collaboratively. So like I don't know, it just baffled me because a young Earth creationist viewpoint to me, and I know that this is a perspective thing, like everything else is, but it seems like a perspective that is untenable unless you're ignoring lots of things.
And I think this just ties into the concept of people having paradigms that they follow. Some without question, some with lots of question, but typically, not even typically, it seems that every single human being that I've ever met has particular paradigms that are often hierarchical. So some of them are more important than others, and they're going to follow these paradigms. And paradigms are just rules, or so base rules for someone to follow in terms of their life. So an example is tradition. You know, someone may follow the traditions that their parents or grandparents put into place, just completely and utterly strictly, even if they are a bit counterintuitive to modern day existence. So it just ties in. I think that's why this example particularly is so makes this so apparent. Basically, it seems that what was the term you used to identify them?
What? Like which
The
one?
Christians who don't believe
Oh,
in
young Earth creationists.
young Earth creationists. So these young Earth creationists have a part of their hierarchical status of rules on the very top of that status of rules, as it must be portrayed. For this to be as important as it is to them, is the tradition of Christianity and following the Bible exactly as it is, word for word, without question.
You know what's actually funny about that though
Hmm.
is that the literal interpretation of the Bible as an account of actual complete historical truth is extremely recent. Like extremely recent. Like
Is now
people
what's the evidence saying that previous generation interpret it more as story, not as fact?
well, so one of those things being that, and I'm gonna forget certain terms here just because I've been out of the loop on like really being into theology for a little bit now. But one of the things is that there was actually a sect of people that whenever they were forming the Christian church, they were trying to decide if taking Jesus's like crucifixion and specifically him rising from the dead, they were actually trying to figure out if what they were going to do was decide that this was a historical, just objective truth, or if it was part of kind of a mythological story. And so, in fact, I was listening to Jordan Peterson on Alex O'Connor's podcast recently, and this is what they talked about: is that there's a specific group of Christians that existed way back in this era that
What era?
it would have been like within a couple decades of Jesus's death. So like,
Oh,
um,
okay. Like 2000 years ago.
within a century.
Mhm.
Especially because now
God,
this is
okay.
also a tough one because there weren't any actual historical accounts mentioning Jesus until Josephus did, which was, I want to say, around 5 decades after the fact. And
Mhm.
all he actually says is that people talked about seeing Jesus risen from the dead. They didn't actually, which people get on me about that, but there is a very large difference between a historian saying people saw this and this happened. For instance, if you're talking
Mhm.
about the War of 1812, and a historian is not going to say people saw this event happen.
Mhm.
The historian is going to say the War of 1812 took place. Like
Mhm.
it is a very noticeable difference. It's essentially, it is not only a secondary account, it is a secondary account 50 to 60 years after whatever event it was happened. And it's not
Mhm.
even, like, and we don't, it doesn't talk about the fact that he like interviewed these people. It is just known that people said that they saw him. And so, like, it's a very difficult
It's a
thing to
game of
lay.
telephone, man. That's
Exactly.
incredible. And it's
Exactly.
50 years removed stories that were just passed on from generations.
Yeah. So here, I'm gonna search up what type of Christian it is because I'm forgetting the name. Um,
When you say what type of Christian, you mean the type that sees the Bible as stories or as maybe analogies. It doesn't seem like a great word to use there, but
so I don't know if I'm gonna be able to find this. I might have to go back and listen to that podcast at some point to get the
the right term.
yeah, the correct term. But ultimately, what it really is that there was a period of time where the church was essentially trying to decide whether to be the Catholic Church meant you had to believe in the literal resurrection of Jesus, and they decided that they did. But the most recent pope, or not the most recent pope, sorry, but a pope within recent years, I don't know if it was the most recent one or not, but a pope within recent years has actually kind of moved towards whatever this sect of Christianity is.
Seeing as
And
stories, correct.
no, seeing. Oh yes, I thought you said seeing it as historical at first. Okay,
Mhm.
yes, seeing it more as a story.
Mhm.
And so it's a tough thing to figure out because, especially with Christianity, it has become so widespread and so synonymous with just religion that
Mhm.
so much of it has also been. I mean, what we're also forgetting about too, which this is something that I like to bring up to Christians a lot. Not as like I honestly don't try. I don't ever try to disprove anyone of their faith. I just try to actually ask them questions because there's lots of things that I couldn't contend with when I thought I believed in God. Like whenever I was like, there was just things I could not contend with. I might be able to give you a biblical loophole, but it was not something that actually like was concrete to me, right? And so I like to hear how other people contend with those discrepancies. And something that I bring up to them quite often is the fact that the Old Testament that the disciples would have read, because like for instance, Matthew specifically, Matthew was a Old Testament scholar. Like he understood the Old Testament very well. In fact, kind of this is where I'm getting to on this is that he would have read the Old Testament in Greek, not in Hebrew.
Mhm.
And
Mm.
so one of the issues with that is that you have translation differences. And so for instance, one of those big translation differences is in Isaiah 7, I want to say it's verse 3. Isaiah 7:3, which is that Isaiah, who's a prophet from the Old Testament, is making a prophecy. Now, just to give the context that I believe and that a lot of like historians that follow theology believe is that Isaiah, when he was making this prophecy, was making a prophecy to the current state of Israel, saying not like to the current state, like to that current state of Israel,
Mhm.
saying
Mhm.
there is going to be a child born of a young woman that will like become the leader and will rule us into success. is essentially what. In fact, in the actual verse, it seems as though he's even referring to a specific woman, right?
Hmm.
And the issue with the translation part of this is that when translated into Greek, the word Alma in Hebrew, which means young woman, was translated into Parthenos in Greek, which Parthenos in Greek is virgin. And
Ah,
so my opinion on it, and what a lot of people at least suspect, is that Matthew, because we also have proof of the disciples writing in, not proof, I shouldn't say that. We suspect that there are things that were written in to the New Testament trying to allow Jesus to fulfill prophecies from the Old Testament. So like one of those being where they went after he was born. There's one account that says that he immediately went back to Nazareth, and there's another account that said, and it also involves some things with King Herod and like having all the young boys killed. And there's another account that says they basically stayed in Bethlehem for a long period of time, which they wouldn't have been able to do that because King Herod would have come and killed Jesus because he was a boy that was born. And he was trying to wipe out all the boys who were just born because he was afraid of there being a new king. But so you have a lot of these kind of things where instead of they stayed in Bethlehem and then went up to a part in Egypt, like these things that it seems like it might have been written in for Jesus to fulfill the prophecy that was prophesied in the Old Testament, right? And one of those being that if Matthew would have read, especially because there's two gospel accounts don't mention a virgin birth, two of them, two of the four don't mention a virgin birth, which seems strange, right? Like that seems like a pretty prominent thing. But one of them, the thing that I'm really getting at is that if Matthew would have read the Greek version and then saw this prophecy of a virgin giving birth to the Savior of Israel, then that's a really noticeable prophecy to then write into Jesus's life, right? So Jesus is being born from a virgin, at least I think, is very likely based on a mistranslation of what the Bible is. So you have all of this, like all of these things surrounding the Bible are difficult to reason with because so much of the interpretation of the Bible has changed a lot. Like even in Deuteronomy 32:8, it mentions, now it's been altered, but like in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it mentions the fact that it doesn't straight up mention this, but the verse, when you look at it, it would suggest that Israel or that Judaism is not a monotheistic religion. It suggests that it's a monolatry, which is the worship of one God, but not the belief in one God. And so,
so interesting to think about those translation differences and questioning whether the translation issues still occur when coming to English, or hypothetically, you have someone who is fluent in Hebrew or Greek and English, like all of them, and then gives you the equivalent in English, but you still like the individual can still make a subjective error on that translation. So I do wonder how the English translation and the errors that can occur there also come into play.
well, then here's the other issue you have with that though, is that a large portion of the Old Testament is, we don't know not just who wrote it, we don't even know when it was written. Because
Hmm.
now we have, like, for instance, the Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest.
And what are
Um,
the yeah? So what are those?
the Dead Sea Scrolls are essentially a combination. I think it's 66 scrolls that we found, and they were just found in a cave in um, the Middle East by a young like shepherd boy, essentially, kind of randomly. But they're the oldest account that we have of the Old Testament. Like,
And
and
are
they're
they
written scrolls.
dated or why? How do we know that they're oldest account?
I think that it's just. I think that historians have.
Deemed
Um,
it with some sort of evidence, like carbon
yeah,
dating or
I
something.
don't know what it is. I don't think they're
Gotcha.
dated in terms of like the actual scrolls being dated. But like they're the oldest account we have. Uh, and
And this is a random thought, but I wonder what the oldest Bible is.
I think one of the churches has it. But here's something else that's also misinterpreted a lot is that the way that we're talking about it right now, we're talking about the Bible like a book. The Bible isn't a book; it's a library. You have different genres of it, like objectively, not this isn't a subjective thing. You have different genres of um, books within the Bible. So you actually even have Bible stories that appear to be like parody or satire purposefully, like the story of Jonah and the big fish. Like there's parts of that book that are almost so intentionally satire that it's hard to ignore. Like for instance, Jonah is sent by God to I want to say Nineveh, and he's sent to Nineveh because the Ninevites are being degenerates and God is going to wipe them out. But he wants to send Jonah to warn them and say, if you do not change your ways, God is going to wipe you out. Now, it's not a guarantee that if you change your ways, God won't wipe you out. But if you do, maybe he'll like have mercy on you. And so Jonah does not want to go. He doesn't want to go at all, dude. He has no interest at any point in the story does he want to go to Nineveh and help these people. He wants them. He wants God to destroy them. He thinks they're like evil. He thinks they're wretched. Blah blah blah. He goes through the whole thing where he gets like he tries to run away from God, and like which is beautiful. And he gets on this boat with a bunch of sailors, and they go through some crazy storm. And he eventually like kind of fesses up and is like, "Hey, I have disobeyed God. Like you need to throw me off this boat, and maybe you will be saved from the storm." And like the sailors do not want to do it. They're like, "No, dude, we're not going to toss you out into the middle of the ocean during this storm. Like you're dead." And so they don't want to do it. And they finally convinces them to like just let him like throw me off. I don't want all of y'all's deaths to happen because of me. And so they throw him off. He gets swallowed by the big fish. He's chilling in the big fish for 3 days, and the big fish fucking spits him out and shit. And then he decides to go to Nineveh, which they actually decide to change their ways. And at the very end of it, this is actually probably one of my favorite stories in the entire Bible because it's actually it's genuinely funny. And it's written in a way that's almost supposed to be funny. Is that he goes up to this hill to kind of decide, like to wait for God to decide if he's going to destroy this city or not. And God decides not to. But God also, to give Jonah shade, God decides to grow this tree, but he like grows it as like initially this like tiny little like plant, you know? And so God, like Jonah just starts dumping on the plant, dude. Like he just starts hating on the plant for no reason. Like he just is immediately hating on the plant. And it's the whole story is kind of a reflection of the fact that like human beings, we can receive God's word, like literally from God. And then we can still turn around and try to actively act as though we are somehow more competent than God. Because Jonah's also mad at God for not destroying Nineveh. Mm-hmm. He's genuinely mad at him. And so it's written kind of as this parody, as this satire in a way. And I'm not trying to like, a lot of people might hear that and like think it's trying to be deflationary. I mean that as the genre of like satire. It's, you know, but then you also have genre, like you have laws in the Bible, but not laws as in like the 10 Commandments. You have like Leviticus is a law book. It is telling you how to behave and what is acceptable and what is not. And it's written in a.
Does it have punishments like laid out?
Yes, it is like it that is the book.
I see what you mean by different genres now.
Well, and it's like it's purposely written that way because you also have, for instance, Lulu. You have like in Leviticus, it teaches you, for instance, like how you're supposed to own slaves and like the proper ways to do it and what the punishments are if you do it incorrectly. But then you also have books like Daniel, which is a minor prophet, and Daniel seems to be at least partially, I should say, definitely partially, an actual just historical account up until like the Maccabean revolt, because he actually prophesies, and there's a whole theory behind this. And I don't know if I really want to get into that, but like he prophesies almost perfectly until the Maccabean revolt, and then after that, his prophecies are a little more, yeah, you know. And so the theory is that whoever was writing Daniel, because Daniel didn't write Daniel, whoever was writing Daniel,
no one wrote their section, correct?
It's again,
gotcha.
We don't know. It's kind of the whole story. Now, I would assume that Matthew specifically did probably write Matthew, but maybe not. Like,
so when it's called Matthew, does that mean it's stories about the life of that disciple?
No. So all 4 gospel accounts are accounts of Jesus's life, told from 4 different disciples. Mm-hmm. And so that's the other issue, is the fact that they don't line up. Now, they don't have to line up perfectly. You know, like if you and me were telling us the same story about one of our friends,
The
it would be
details will be a little bit misconstrued. Yeah.
right. But there's certain things that don't make any sense. Like if Jack was born of a virgin and you asked both of us to tell you Jack's life story, that seems like something that we would both
Mm-hmm.
very clearly point out.
Okay, I get it now.
Like, and then there's also little things like, for instance, Pontius Pilate, as the Gospels go on, which the Gospels were not written at the same time; they were written over the course of time, and so the latest Gospel, you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The last Gospel, comparatively to the first Gospel, Pontius Pilate, who's like the Roman officer who essentially okays Jesus' crucifixion. As the Gospels go on, Pontius Pilate becomes more and more of a like very innocent character. So he goes from kind of being like like I don't really care, crucify him, to being very openly like I wash my hands cleans of this. Like I did not want to do this. This was something that was forced upon me by the Jews who wanted him to die. Like it becomes progressively more like flanderized. Essentially, is what the character like what happens to the character. And so there's so much of the Bible that appears to be not just stories as in essentially literally stories, but it also appears to be written in a storyteller way, you know? And that also is not to say that if the Bible was written as a story, that's kind of the point what I was getting at in this whole tirade that has happened, is that the literal interpretation of the Bible is something that's recent. It's something that's new. It was not something that was just the way that it was forever. And for a very long time, um, people associated the Bible. It's kind of how Jordan Peterson does it, honestly. Like where a lot of people, if they actually knew his views, would not consider him Christian. They'd be like, well,
Mhm.
you know. But he essentially his viewpoint is that you cannot remove the mythological and psychological from the historical. You just can't remove it because, for instance, like there's just verses in the Bible that obviously historically, like how does that even happen? Like for instance, like with Joshua at one point, the sun stands still for a day. Like the fact that no other civilization mentions that ever is pretty strange. But his argument isn't literally that the sun stood still for a day. It's that some form of mythology is what that is referring to, just like the power of God, really. And that cannot be removed from the historical context, which I agree with him on that. And so this does not mean that Christianity isn't true. Like this could be a story, and the mythological is baked in with the historical,
Mhm.
and it's just supposed to be kind of if you broke down Christianity into everything, and you were just like, okay, what Christianity really is on the most base value is these values, and if you hold these values, you are Christian. If you live your life by these values, you're Christian. I can get behind that. It's really just like the actual literal interpretation of the Bible that I have issues with, specifically because if you want to talk about morality and morality coming from God, which is a big argument, is the fact that you can't have objective morality unless you ground it in God. I mean, if you want to get into that part, we definitely can. I think you would have more to like, that's a moral conversation. So I think you'd have more to like add into it. But there's a lot of, I would consider morally objectionable things within
I mean,
specifically.
you already broke down the idea of the law book in the Bible or the law genre, literally laying out that slavery is acceptable. This is how you do it. Did it specify who to do it to?
Oh, yeah. It gives you
Oh, wow.
everything.
So
So
it
here's
said that one race was meant to be enslaved.
So here's what it is that so Gentiles is the term that's broadly applied to non-Jews. So Hebrew slaves, it was usually more of an indentured servitude type
Hmm.
slavery. But there was definitely like it was definitely also slavery. So there's a couple rules here is that Hebrew slaves could only be slaves for 7 years. And on the seventh year, they were to be set free with
That
all
is
of their
identical.
possessions and
Wow.
belongings. And so, but here's the other thing is that if the master gives this slave a wife and that wife and him have a child, then that the man who is enslaved can either choose to now not be enslaved and lose his wife and child because they were the masters, or he can choose to remain a slave to be with his wife and child. So like that's one of the weird little things. But non-Hebrew slaves, there's no specification on you have to keep them for 7 years or not. Like, and now the Jubilee year, which is every 50 years, it does say set slaves free, but again, we don't actually really know if that applies to non-Hebrews because the non-Hebrews don't seem to have all of these little allowances for them. Um, and then it even specifies like there's a verse in the Bible. I don't I think it's in Leviticus. I just don't want to like really sit on that one because I'm not completely sure. I would assume it is, just that's where a lot of the stuff revolving slavery is. There's also some in Romans in the New Testament, but besides the point, like there's a point where it says if a master beats his slave and the slave gets up after a day or two, this like the master shall not be punished. And now if he kills the slave, then he is to be punished. But you're allowed to beat them. And like it specifically says beat with a rod. So it's not like just smacking them. It's beating them with a rod. And as long as they are not crippled or dead, you're fine. And so
And then it's supposed to be this objectively moral thing, and yet if you were to ask any Christian nowadays if that is considered moral, obviously their answer would be no. So it's like, how can this be considered the objective moral book, moral rule book, when yet today's subjectivity, the common culture that we have now, does not agree with that, so therefore can't be objective? Well, I guess it can be, and an subjective opinion can disagree with it, but it's
would you
hard to
like to
believe
look
that
like the
our society would ever kind of shift to thinking suddenly slavery is now okay.
yeah. I mean,
So
you would like are you kind of just like proposing that, or are you also asking to some extent like for what the like Christian apologetic response would be?
yes, yes,
Okay, so
both.
often there's a few of them. So the most prominent one I hear is either like it's not real slavery, it's indentured servitude, which is a very weak argument to me, especially because the easiest thing I can say back is if we're talking about an almighty, timeless, powerful God or all powerful, timeless God, then I still think he could have come up with a better solution for debts than indentured servitude. Um, but regardless, it doesn't say indentured servants, it says slavery. And if we're going to claim that it wasn't the same type of slavery, then we also can't claim that when Jews were slaves in Egypt, that it was the same type of slavery that we think of, right? That it kind of follows the same line of logic to me. But that's a claim I hear pretty often. Another one is kind of a, and that one also usually relies on things like the Jubilee year and the 7-year rule, which I don't think most Christians realize don't apply to non-Hebrews, but or at least the 7-year rule doesn't. And then the other thing I hear relatively frequently is like, which this one is probably the funniest to me, which is like at the time, things were just different back then, and so God wasn't going to
No
like get.
longer objective.
And so
If you're going off of timeline, it's no longer objective.
exactly. And so what my claim to that always is that if God is timeless and he is the reason that morality can be objective, then God's morality cannot fall in with the time of the people, and the people's morality has to fall in line with God, no matter what
Yeah,
the time.
no.
And then something else I also often throw out there is just blanketly God for like completely destroys the idea of being able to murder. He completely destroys the idea of being able to lie, to cheat, or like to be an adulterer specifically, to lust, to worship other gods. Like these are all the 10 Commandments. These are one of the first things we get in the Bible. Like this is textbook. And yet he couldn't throw slavery in there. Like that just like why could he do away with murder, but he couldn't do away with slavery?
And I think maybe the Christian would say something along the lines of, at least the only argument that I can think of that would actually make sense is that our culture, well, actually, whether or not our culture shifts back to a paradigm of thinking that slavery is acceptable, because that kind of is the only way for that objective morality being true to be the case, in my mind, seems that we need to have our culture shift back to being enslavers rather than on the very progressive wave that we currently are. What's happened throughout the entirety of history? More and more in progression towards the freedom, the
Sovereignty of human beings.
yes, yes, exactly. So we would need a complete and utter shift in the literal direction of the morality, is the moral scope of our common culture.
Well, and something I also hear pretty often, which this one is one that actually, and I know it shouldn't, this one is actually one that like actually actively bothers me, is that a lot of times they'll kind of pull out the fact that the abolitionist movement and the like feminist movement and a lot of these things were based on the backs of Christians, which
Mm.
even that claim
Like the
is tough.
Quakers definitely supported them. Like you had there was definitely northern Christians who were kind of the first people to get on board. I think that there's definitely a lot of validity there. That doesn't mean that they were the only ones. And if you look at it proportionally to the majority of Christians, I have no idea, obviously, but Southern culture currently is very Christian based. In Southern culture, back when slavery was allowed in the United States, I presume was still very Christian based. So that's a large portion of the Christian population in the United States that was still literally promoting and actively engaging
Well,
in
and
slavery.
even just to kind of throw that one out of the water, it
Because
kind
it
of
is
combines.
making large presumptions. So I agree.
And but like just to take the argument that you used a little bit earlier and kind of throw it into this one, if we're talking about a society that has progressed, right, then it is tough for me to accept the fact that all of these principles that Christians also fought against. It's kind of like the whole thing that people will often point out that a Galileo was a Christian. He was also actively prosecuted for not believing that the earth was flat by Christians because they thought it went against the Bible. So like he was actively prosecuted, like he was, or I said prosecuted, persecuted by the church, specifically the church. And he actually was afraid to bring his findings because he knew that the church would persecute him. And so the reason that Galileo was Christian was not because he thought, I'm not actually making a claim about Galileo here. I'm just kind of making a claim about people back then. The reason that he was Christian was not because he thought that it was the objective truth. He was Christian because everybody else was. And so it's kind of the whole idea of like, yeah, most of architecture and most of all these things were built on the back of religion because for all of time, most people have been religious. That doesn't prove that has no value to me in terms of the actual like credibility of the source. Like I can be a if I decide that I'm going to be a Nazi, right, in terms of a lot of my values, but then I also decide that people with gender dysphoria should be given completely free and completely like completely socially accepted um, gender transitioning surgeries and all this different stuff. Does that automatically mean that Nazis had things figured out because I decided to be more progressive
Hmm.
than it's kind of like, and obviously that's probably not the best example, especially
Yeah.
because gender dysphoria and gender transition surgery are specifically things that we could also get into very deeply.
Hmm.
But like, I don't know. It's kind of a genetic fallacy to me in terms of an argument. It's like you're in kind of in a reverse way. You're claiming that because somebody was a part of a source, that source, even though this person is far removed from it, is still accurate, even though the reason that we are not doing the things that the source supported is the fact that we've progressed away from it. Like
Hmm.
we have become less and less religious, and as that has happened, we have become at least according to like a lot of subjective things, we become more and more progressive in allowing people to be themselves and all these different allowances. And that's as we've gotten less and less religious. And so it's hard for me to listen to the claim that these things were built on the backs of religion because one, the religion itself does not support that. And then two, again, if you go ask the majority of people in the mid 1800s what they're whether they're atheist or religious, not even theistic, I mean, sorry, theistic or non-theistic, the vast majority of them are going to be theistic. They're just going to be. That's just the nature of what the time period was. And theistic is just
Um,
the in God, like any God. Like Hindus are theistic, Buddhists are, or okay, Buddhism is a weird one. Hindus are theistic.
yeah,
Um,
Buddhism was an interesting one.
like the Native Americans would have been theistic in the sense that they believed in like deities. Like it's the belief in God versus just the belief in no supernatural being, essentially.
Yeah. So, and then you look at today, and I'm just trying to come up with this random statistic, like kind of off the, just because I can. So in 1950/60, roughly 60% of the population was religious. And today, this must include spirituality because it says 85%. Oh,
Or
world population. World population. What? Okay. Okay. And these polls are tough to use because the people answer stuff so strangely, especially when they were raised in a Christian household, have no idea what Christianity even means, and they just claim to be Christian because that's the tradition, the paradigm that's a part of their hierarchy that they follow. And all that could really mean in terms of their paradigm, their hierarchy, is that the idea of being Christian comes just above the idea of being informed enough to make an actual decision. So they don't care as much about thinking super deeply about it because one, that's an enormous loophole they could send themselves into. They could do just as much research as you have, read the entire Bible, do just ungodly amounts of research to finally come to make like some proper decision, which you never have enough information to do that because we don't have enough information, period.
It's one of the main reasons that I keep saying that I still don't know. Like
Of course.
Christianity might be 100% true. In fact, part of me wishes that it was, in the sense that it would make my life a lot easier in terms of choices that I have to make. It would narrow them down a lot in terms of what
So
I.
much. It would just be devoting our lives to to God. That would literally change everything. To change the scope of almost every single human being that
There's so
exists
much
today,
less of
because
what
we're
we have
so
to
far
figure out.
removed from actual religious life. Would you say?
There's so much less that people like you and me who are trying to understand all of these things. There's literally, you almost, in fact, you might cut it more than in half of what we have to figure out. Because now, like, let's just say Christianity is blanketly true, 100%. Let's even take the young Earth creationist literal interpretation of the Bible. Now there is a literal guidebook telling me exactly what I can and cannot do. That is perfect. That's all I want. Like, I want, okay, I don't know if that's true. I would love if somewhere, somehow, there was actually a way for me to just objectively know if what I was constantly doing was right or wrong.
But in terms of right or wrong, it's like promoting, for example, so because you are devoting yourself to a God, you therefore everything that you do is right is under the name of God. But not having that religion, not having that God, everything you do is up to your interpretation of whether or not it's right, or at least promoting the direction of the life that you'd like to live. So
Well,
therefore, the scope of things that you can do that are acceptable to you or your peers is gargantuan in comparison.
Well, then, like, here, let's just give you a very clear example of the fact that if you were actually going to take a literal interpretation of the Bible and a literal interpretation of all of it, then someone like William Lane Craig, who I don't know if he actually takes a completely literal interpretation of the Bible, but like specifically the slaughter of the Canaanites, right, is something that's hotly debated in like circles of theology, because it's one of those things that is really difficult for people to have any level of like how is this moral? How is this just? How is God like saying to go do this? Okay. Um, well, to conventional morality, God saying to go murder the fighting men of a place, which is, this is another funny thing we could get into, but like going and killing the fighting men of an area, that, funny enough, that seems relatively acceptable. It's like, well, that's essentially just war, which is obviously not a good thing, but it's war. War happens, and war can happen for just reasons, like World War II and the Nazis. Like, we had to go over there and fight. That was a just reason to go and fight.
It was just in the behalf of the United States, just in the
Yeah,
behalf of oh, I almost said the Allied powers.
yeah, that is what it is.
I was thinking, what was the other name of the
Their Axis.
Axis? That's what it was. Yeah. Okay. Then yeah, the Allied powers.
Yeah, so like that seems more acceptable, but it's like the murder of these innocent
Unless you get
civilians.
utilitarian, and then you're like, yeah,
Yeah,
I'm not going to bring that up actually. Well, I did. Like, I'm not
utilitarianism is
gonna
a
talk
tough
about
one. It like
Do you want to get
utilitarianism.
on the utilitarian wave right now, or do you want to finish this thought?
Okay, I'll pump the thought out first.
Okay.
According to conventional morality, what the ban is, the thing I told you about, where you're going to murder all the women, children, everything. That's tough to come to conventionally. And so a lot of Christians either kind of make the claim that, like, okay, historically this didn't really happen. Like, it's kind of just a story about the people of like Joshua's group and like him going through, and like it's a raw story, like uh but there, like, William Lane Craig, actually his claim is that everything that God does by the nature of God is good and is just. So anything that happens because of God, or sorry, anything that happens that is good and just is because of God, and anything that God does is good and just. Like he literally cannot do wrong, essentially, is what the claim is. And so his thing is that the ban was actually good and just. Like he actually says, in fact, it's on an Alex O'Connor podcast.
Even though it goes entirely against the
Yes.
Ten Commandments, I gotcha.
And so even though, well, I mean, technically it doesn't because it's not murder. It's like it's not viewed as murder because what God says is murder does not align with God saying to go wipe out these civilizations. So it's like, you know, it's such a, it really, I mean, to me, I hate saying this because it does make me feel like I'm trying to deflate it. And it's hard for me to not to want to do that because it just feels so absurd to me.
And the bias, implicit biases as well.
Obviously, yeah. Like, especially because of the fact that I came from a hyper-religious household and now I am not, makes that probably worse. In fact, most people I know that were hyper-religious households and then became atheists are much more inclined to be deflationary towards it, especially because they're people who typically know the Bible very well. Funny how that works. But, like, I don't know. It's just such a tough thing to reason with it all because it feels like such a cop out all the time, especially because if you actually catch them in something that makes it seem as though they don't even have a biblical loophole, what they can really do. In fact, this is something that Ben Shapiro did to Alex O'Connor. Is he even straight up said, like, look, my appeal is to the fact that I don't have to know these things. Like, it's not up to me. Stop. Like, that to me seems like if I'm going to appeal to the fact that I have to just trust my senses of fact, like reason and faculty, which is a hard thing to appeal to because you cannot trust your reason. You cannot trust your faculties. But if I'm going to appeal to that, then how is that somehow worse?
You can't trust it entirely.
Yeah. If I'm going to appeal to that, then how is that somehow worse than appealing to an almighty, all-knowing, all-time being that none of us have any actual, like, legitimate indication of?
The only thing we know is that we have logic and reason. So those are the tools that we can use to deduct whether or not this is true. And if the logic and reason says that there's fallacies and it doesn't add up, you are just going against the tools that you are embedded into your existence to hope that that is the truth.
This is actually a perfect example because I had this conversation with my mom. She kind of used the example, or maybe I brought it up to her as like an example that maybe like a Christian would use. I can't remember exactly which one, but she had kind of made the claim that, like, you know, it's funny to hear me talk about the fact that I don't want to base my life on faith whenever so much of my life is based on faith. And so a common example of that, just to give an extreme one, is like we all have faith, quote unquote, that the sun isn't just going to randomly drop out of gravitational orbit or like explode, right?
Okay, a better one. We have faith the United States is not going to crumble.
Yeah, we have faith that China isn't just going to come bomb us for no reason. Like, I mean, but
we have faith the United States has the capabilities to protect us from that.
Yeah, we do. But the faith in that is not faith, because what faith is, what it literally is believing with not a lack of evidence, or sorry, not with the no evidence. It's believing with a lack of like substantive evidence. And so, but the reason that I have faith in the sun not exploding or the United States not crumbling or anything like that is because I have a mountain of evidence that shows me that these should not happen. It's not that I know they will not happen. Again, the sun could explode right now. We wouldn't know for another like 7 minutes, but that's fine. Like, it could happen. The reason I don't think it's going to happen, and the reason that I have faith that it's not going to happen, is because I have billions of years that show me that it probably will not happen. It's like, it's just such it feels like an argument that
billions of years and then 20 years of complete and utter personal experience. Billions of years of like not prehistoric, but evidence based on our
literally just pre-me. Like literally just billions of years of pre-me. I have like it just feels like it's the same reason I have faith in the fact that my computer is not going to die until it tells me it's going to die, is literally just because after using my computer over the last 5 years, it has never died on me at 30%. Like, it just, I don't know. It's one of those arguments I just really dislike because it seems to be misusing the word of what faith is. Faith and is not having a mountain of evidence and choosing to follow the evidence. It's having a mountain of and not even anti-evidence. It's just having a mountain of lack and choosing to follow it anyways. Like
and often followed because of familial history or peer pressure to an extent, or just what your culture and what you are exposed and taught. Just as the people that end up joining Hamas, the only thing that they were exposed to was the people around them. So what they know is what the people around them are telling them. So if everyone around them is telling them that Israelis are horrid people that need to be wiped off the face of the planet, they are going to believe that. So for them to have, I'm kind of getting but they're still having faith that what they're being told is true. We're literally placing faith in every single moment of our existence, because we're placing faith in the fact that what I'm about to say is what I want to say. We're placing faith in the fact that what I am aware of, the experiences that I have, are truly what I've experienced. We put faith in, because if you don't have a lick of faith, you don't know anything, because you don't have the faith that what you know is even true. Therefore, you don't even have it.
And the only thing I would actually disagree with you on there, because I think it was a like great point. The only thing I would actually even say though is that someone who actually has faith in the fact that everything that they're hearing is true is someone who is doing things incorrectly, because one of the bases of science and even just reasoning and logic in general is kind of always, at least at the base of everything, knowing that we don't really know.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of that whole thing is, I don't know that the sun is not going to explode.
Mm-hmm.
I just assume that it's not based on things that I know,
Based on all
which
the
is
evidence.
it didn't explode yesterday.
Yeah.
And like, so just to also kind of piggyback off of that, and I think we can hop off the Christian or the just religion train for a while, because we've been in my domain here for a minute. But like, you were talking about like family and like the fact that geography is a massive role in if whether you're religious or not. One of my main issues with like just theism in general is the fact, or specifically monotheism, that says if you're not believing in that, you're going to go to hell or like to some bad place. Because not every religion has a hell necessarily. If you take a country like Vietnam is 80%, might be a little bit more, might be a little bit less. I can't remember exactly what it is. It's right around 80%. 80% non-theistic. So we're not even going to like buckle down on a specific religion here, right? We're just going to tackle theism and non-theism. 80% are non-theistic versus Christianity, like, because now we're going to make it even like harder to make a bigger percentage out of it. The U.S., I'm assuming I read the same thing you did, which is like 70% of Christians or 70% of Americans identify as Christian, right? Now, what does that actually mean? That's a tough one. But like, let's just call it what it is. The same reason that you might identify as non-theistic, but you might believe in like deities or whatever.
So like that's a really okay. That was 2020. Apparently, a study done in 2023 says 47% identify as religious, and 33 of that is spiritual. Or no. Sorry, 33% identify as spiritual but not religious. So the polls are tough to say. That we'll go with the most recent, saying 50%.
Okay, well then we'll just call it 50%. So that means if you're born in just America, not even a specific state, and let's take into account of how small Vietnam is, just so that we're aware of that. If you were just born in America, you now have a significantly higher chance of going to heaven than you do if you're just born in Vietnam, which that does not sound like the way that an equal, just, all-knowing, all-loving God would proportionally divide his people. Because how on earth, like, you don't even have a chance if you're born in Vietnam. You don't. Like, if 80% of the people around you don't believe in a God, let alone specifically the Christian God, how on earth are you supposed to believe in that? It's just like,
and considering Vietnam's perspective of the United States, they're probably even more anti-Christian.
Actually, Vietnam and the United States are on relatively solid terms.
At this point, oh, I was kind of under the impression that Shit, hit the
No, the
fan
Vietnamese
after the
people.
Vietnam War.
Actually, this is a good thing to talk about because it's one of the things that I find so incredible about the Vietnam War. The Vietnamese people, and obviously I've never been to Vietnam. I wasn't a part of the Vietnam War. I don't have very many Vietnamese friends like to talk to about this, but at least from what I am aware of, especially regarding Vietnam like war history, the Vietnamese people really did not harbor very much resent towards America, and almost always like I think it might have been the fact that they were colonized, like they were colonial, like they were part of a
Colonies of
colonial
Britain?
system. Yeah, for so and France for
Mm,
so long. In fact, they literally fought the French off. The America helped them fight the French off because FDR was a very big component of being a free country and being
mhm,
allowed to do what you wanted to do. And
mhm.
so after World War II, Vietnam had literally just fought off the French. And then in 55, guess who came rolling in? So like I think it might just be the fact that they were under colonial powers for so long that the fact that we were not actually trying, like I am not going to make any positive claims about the Vietnam War. The way that we did that was awful. I still can't fathom what our actual strategy really was, other than it was literally just to kill as many Viet Cong as we could. But we were not trying to colonize. We were at like our actual main goal was just to stop communism.
Mhm.
So I think that might be why. But the Vietnamese people are an incredibly gracious, amazing group of people, at least from what I know about the way that Americans were treated, especially during the Vietnam War. There didn't seem to be a lot of malice from the like, actual people of Vietnam. Now, that is not one of the main issues with fighting guerrilla warfare. It's something we've run into in Iraq and Afghanistan too. Is how do you know who's a civilian, who's not? Right? So like that's tough, but it's pretty rare that you hear like horrid stories about civilians in Vietnam treating American soldiers poorly. Like, in fact, it's rare enough that with all the reading and things I've done about the Vietnam War, I can't actually really think of anything. Which is also surprising considering we treated them like the civilians of Vietnam. We treated them horridly. Like we one of our main strategies when we'd go into a village, we'd check if they had any weapons caches or anything, and then we would just as soon as we found anything, we would just put white phosphorus grenades in that village and just let the village burn down.
Jesus Christ.
Like there was the amount of court martialing that was going on during Vietnam, and a lot of it people got admitted as innocent because what was going on is these people would go on these snatch and grab missions where they're supposed to get these Viet Cong people, bring them back, capture them, and interrogate them. And so often, what that did was we would just go into these villages and actually just murder civilians, like literally just drag them out of their homes and shoot them because they were trying to get away from us. We
Jesus Christ.
also, again, just I know I told you this yesterday, but just to throw it out there again, we dropped more bombs on Vietnam than the entirety of the war of World War II. There was more bombs dropped from America onto tiny little Vietnam than the entire spectrum of battle in World War II.
It's completely and utterly incomprehensible, and it's all because of the fear of communism, which is just more and more incomprehensible because of the idea that we were supposed to be the world police for democracy when it's just not how you promote peace. It's just not. It's
I think
putting your political ideology as a prerequisite for communications or any sort of peace with another community is not how you get peace. That's not how that works.
I think it was even less of that. And what I really think the Vietnam War boils down to is a few little things, which is one, we were not prepared to go in there at all. We didn't know what we were getting ourselves into, even though that these people had fought off a colonial power for their entire existence. They were fully prepared to deal with a big Western power, fully prepared. Um, and we completely underestimated them. We didn't know what we were getting ourselves into. And the other thing is that our strategy there was not okay. Here's Vietnam. We're going to land here and then push our way through while maintaining all of this. It was we are going to land here and then we're going to jump all around, but we're always going to return to here so that even though we're going to go in and kill thousands of people, as soon as we leave, the people who didn't die can just come back in and take the area over. So we didn't make any progress. We weren't doing anything other than dropping bombs and letting Marines get killed. Like it was ridiculous. And then also something that people do not talk about, like just frankly, even now, unless I'm just blissfully unaware, which is always a possibility, is the fact that by like the mid to late 60s, we knew that we weren't going to win the war the way we were doing it, but we were embarrassed because we were like, what is the world going to think of America if we pull out of Vietnam, dude? Like, we just dealt with the Nazis and we can't beat the Vietnamese. Like, what is happening? And so we were embarrassed by it. And so instead of pulling out and saving thousands of, actually, like tens of thousands of lives, because at one point we had over 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam. Like, if we'd have just pulled out and been like, hey, this war, not only is it kind of unwinnable, frankly, we don't care. Like, it would have been so much better. But we were embarrassed, and we also couldn't accept the fact that the way that we had fought war in World War II was not the way that you fight war against against guerrilla soldiers in a jungle. It's the exact same problem we're having right now, or not technically right now, but like the exact same problem we had in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is when you try to fight a war the way that wars are supposed to be fought against a group of people who are just do not care.
When you follow rules when the others aren't, you're going to lose.
Even if you have all the firepower and everything in the world, guess what happened? Russia tried to go into Afghanistan. We tried to go into Afghanistan. Both of us got destroyed. And guess what? It doesn't matter that we killed way more of them than they killed us. It doesn't matter that our kill ratio in Vietnam was 10-1. At least that's what they say. I don't believe that. But especially because we were counting civil, like there was literally, if they are dead and they are Vietnamese, they are Viet Cong. That was something that they were told to do. So like our kill numbers were also not realistic. But let's just say it was 10-1. Sure, great. We killed 10 of them for every one of us that died. We didn't need to be over there in the first place, and we still didn't achieve.
None of us need to fucking die.
So, like, what was the point ever?
All of this just to say that Vietnamese people have an extraordinarily tiny chance of going to heaven.
Oh my god.
I literally remember that. I was like, I'm gonna bring this back up eventually.
But they still are goated.
They seem to be phenomenal people, absolutely.
And I do gotta get, as like, this is a crazy thing for an American to say, and it actually is like, it makes half of my body like almost self-destruct because I do love me some red, white, and blue. I love America. I'm hyped about it as much as I hate what we are doing. But like, the Vietnamese are dogs, man. We had Marines going. The Marine Corps is the most feared fighting force in the entire world. You do not mess with Marines. You drop 100 Marines into a country with enough equipment, I guarantee you there will be so much havoc that has the potential to be caused. And yet we had 500,000, not Marines, we had 500,000 troops in Vietnam with a massive section of the Marine Corps.
Trained by the best army in the entire.
Yeah. Like trained by the post-World War II Marine Corps. And these guys went in there. Now, granted, the equipment we give Marines is terrible. Marines are always 20 years behind. It's because we know they're just dogs. And so we just give them nothing. And we're like, all right, have fun. Go figure that out. But, like, you know who had less equipment? The Viet Cong.
Fucking civilians who are choosing to fight for their survival.
And they were dogging us. Now, granted, the way that they fought the war, I would consider brutal because they were using mines and booby traps. But we were an invading force into their country. If someone tried to invade the ranch, if a bunch of Marines came to the ranch and tried to invade me, frankly, I don't care how I kill them. They just need to not be there anymore. So, like,
you're just fighting for your survival. It's plain and simple.
Yeah, like, now granted, that's also what the Marines are doing at that point because they're not America. They're just individual people who've been dropped there and told to do this. So they're also just fighting for survival. But like, still, like the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, I gotta give them some credit. They're dogs, man. They fought off the French. They fought off the post World War II Cold War America, which might
Literally,
be the most.
arguably the strongest militia you'll ever see in the existence of history.
I mean, I really don't like. I don't know what even to compare Cold War America to. Like, we were so overpowered. The only country that had a chance of standing up to us was Russia. And
And
guess
it's
what
solely
happened to
because of
Russia?
nuclear warfare.
Guess what happened to Russia? Well, I mean, actually, they became Russia. They weren't Russia.
Yeah,
That's what.
that's very true. Very true.
Dude, this gets me riled up. I'm on a red, white, and blue wave right now. I'm let's go.
I,
I'm so hyped to be an American.
I struggle with it, man, because there's so much corruption and that's just where I really struggle with it because I really love the founding concepts of this nation and the concepts that we were built on in the war eras, except for the world democracy, which I just disagree with.
Yeah,
And
the world police force is just a bad move.
I agree. I think world
Also, I mean, you also know that I'm probably the
police
most anti-government person you know. I mean, at least I would assume I am, unless you just have some like radical friends.
Jay Purvis.
Yeah, he might have me beat.
I can't say that name in the future.
I mean, dude, my dad is. I'm not scared for my dad at all. My dad might be the most like just dude, like the most man ever.
No person, no audience member wants to go after that man.
Yeah, if you attempt, he would be itching for it. He's excited for it, dude. He really is.
Anyways, I think this is probably a good stopping point because not only is it about 9, I need to eat some dinner. Um, and yeah, I don't know. I think we cranked out some good shit. Now I know like you did carry there because we talked about your shit mainly because we talked about Vietnam, which you just read about, and Christianity. So, but I still contributed here and there, especially earlier. So,
I mean, are you like, are you unhappy with the way that played out at all?
oh no, dude, no. I actually felt good about it because like I was so for the first time when you were talking about Christianity because usually I kind of clock out because I'm like fuck, I don't really give a shit. I really just don't care because I was trying to be a podcaster. I was much more engaged in trying to find good questions to help the audience and help myself. So I
I
enjoyed
thought
it.
you asked good questions. And I think it to some extent, at least for these first couple, like the next one we do, I definitely need